Well, good evening, everybody. Friends, writers, readers, lovers of ideas, thank you for being here. You're the audience who refused to stay home. You're the readers who stood up when others tried to shut the book. And this turnout right here, over capacity I might say, reminds us of something fundamental. You cannot cancel curiosity, you cannot cancel compassion, and you cannot silence a city that believes in the exchange of ideas and freedom of expression. My name is Sarah Hanson-Young and I have the honour tonight of being your MC for the evening. I firstly want to acknowledge that we stand here on the land of the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the Adelaide Plains, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And to those young First Nations writers who were so desperate to have their books listened to, read and sold at this year's Writers' Week, to you I say, keep writing, we will keep reading. Welcome all to this special event. Discipline, silence is complicity, but what is the real cost of speaking up? This event is being recorded by the ABC for their Big Ideas program, which is pretty exciting. And the event has been organised by the Australian Friends of Palestine Association in partnership with and as part of the Constellations Not Writers' Week. Thank you to the organisers for putting on this event. Now, at some point there is going to be QR codes on the screens. One is for donations to Constellations Festival to support the appearance of authors across the program, and the other will enable you to become a member of the Australian Friends of Palestine. Donations, of course, to Australian Friends of Palestine and Writers SA can also be made in the foyer outside. And while the ABC is filming in here tonight, I've been requested to ask you to refrain from filming yourself or taking photographs. That's a request of the Town Hall. So put that phone away, make sure it's on silent, and let's get on with the evening. Firstly, I want to say, tonight we meet under unusual circumstances. Not as part of the official Adelaide Writers' Week, but in its spirit. The lights, the chairs, the microphones may have changed, but the purpose is unchanged: to listen, to challenge, to imagine. And this is what writers' festivals were built for. And even when governments lose their nerve, as a community, as citizens, we keep faith. The truth is, the cancellation of this year's festival was not an administrative or a logistical decision. It was political, highly political. It was an act that revealed fear. Fear of dissent, fear of complexity, fear of those who dare to write what they see, a fear of feeling challenged by the voices of those less understood and often silenced. Fear indeed is powerful, but I can see by this room tonight that hope and empathy is stronger, and curiosity is contagious. When the Premier and his government sought to distance themselves from voices it didn't like and to shut them down, it crossed a line that every democracy must hold sacred: the line between political interference and the freedom of expression. Culture cannot thrive in climates of political cowardice. When a government decides which books are too dangerous or which authors must be cancelled, it tells us more about its own insecurity than about the ideas it seeks to suppress. But look around this room. Look at the writers who kept writing, the thinkers who kept thinking, and the readers who kept reading, the citizens who keep asking questions and want to learn. You are the real custodians of South Australia's literary spirit. You are proving that this community will not be dictated to by those who prefer comfort to courage. And there could be no better symbols of that courage than the two remarkable women that we are going to be lucky to have with us tonight, Louise Adler and Randa Abdel-Fattah. Louise Adler has spent her life building platforms for voices others might fear or ignore. As a publisher, a cultural leader, a provocateur, dare I say a difficult woman, in the best sense of the word. She has always defended the principle that literature must not just be safe, it must be bold. Time and time again, she has shown that culture is not a luxury of democracy, it is a foundation. And like all foundations, it requires defence and looking after. When Louise directed Adelaide Writers' Week, she treated it not as a social event for polite applause, but as a public forum. Free to attend, free not to attend. Freedom to express with the social contract of respect and learning. One that belonged to all who care about ideas. Under her leadership, this festival mattered. It attracted debate and passion, and at times raised an eyebrow or two, precisely because it was honest, real, and alive. Its genuine and authentic success threatened some of those in power. Because living culture is unpredictable. It cannot be stage managed by PR companies or a politician's press secretary. It cannot be reduced to talking points. And that is why Louise's work matters more now than ever. In a world, more than ever. Alongside Louise, of course, is our star author tonight, Randa Abdel-Fattah, an author, a lawyer, an activist, and a relentless truth teller. Randa writes with clarity and courage about what it means to belong, to be seen, to speak when silence is usually expected. Her writing gives a voice to young people and to those whose stories rarely make the front page. Her writing paints a picture of those who come to our nation, those who choose to call it home. It paints a picture of who we are as a nation and the community of people we are, a diverse people, curious of one another, and desperate for truth and understanding. And as the world has watched on, as tens of thousands of children have been slaughtered, and hundreds of thousands more left starving in the bloody war in Gaza, the courage to speak for these children, for their truth, and to speak truth to power means more than ever. And as we just all woke this morning with the news that President Trump and the Netanyahu government have launched an all-out attack on the Iranian regime, we all know in this room that it's the innocent civilians, the mothers, the babies, the fathers and the children who will suffer most if this war escalates. Already we know that the first victims of Mr. Trump's bombs were school children, young girls killed when the bombs hit their primary school in northern Iran, dozens of who were dead before you or I were in our beds asleep last night. I have to say here, in speaking my own truth and courage, that our government's response to this latest act of aggression from the United States is wrong. Following the US into another illegal war is wrong. It will do harm to Australia's reputation and does nothing to reinforce the international rules-based order. It does nothing to strengthen democracy. The people of Iran deserve I agree. The people of Iran deserve freedom from both their brutal regime and the freedom from a brutal, bloody war. We cannot bomb our way to peace. In a world so shaken by fear and uncertainty, we need truth-tellers, both political and cultural leaders, with courage. We need more storytellers of hope to overpower and drown out the merchants of hate and fear. So tonight, we're honoured to hear from both of these remarkable women, and of course, the highly acclaimed journalist Peter Grester. All three of these not simply as writers or cultural figures, but as citizens who understand that democracy is an unfinished draft. It requires editors, critics, and readers who won't let one government or one premier or one act of censorship define the boundaries of our imagination and our creativity. Now, you may not agree with everything that Randa has said or written. You may not agree with what Peter or Louise say tonight, and none of us have to. But being prepared to listen, to question, to share in the exchange of ideas is the very purpose of defending democracy. And you, the audience, your attendance is not a small thing. You are participating in something bigger than just a replacement event. You are reclaiming the space that politics tried to take away. You are showing that South Australians, and Australians more broadly, don't need permission from the Premier's office to celebrate art, speech or thought. And I have no doubt that Adelaide's Writers' Week will return stronger for having survived this sorry saga. I, like so many of you, loved and love Adelaide Writers' Week. And I was so upset and so angry and so disappointed with Peter Malinauskas, and I still am. And maybe that makes me a difficult woman too. But I'm here to take that and to say, let's all be difficult together. Because it is not his Writers' Festival. It is not the government's Writers' Festival. It is ours. It is Adelaide's. It is part of our big, beautiful city's cultural identity, and we are here tonight to defend its legacy and its future. The defiant energy in this room right here gives me hope and inspiration that Adelaide and South Australia is a community where we reject the hate and we embrace the curiosity and compassion for others. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Peter Grester. Peter Grester is an Australian journalist, an author, media freedom activist and academic. He began his career loving Latin America, the Middle East and Africa for the BBC and Al Jazeera. He made headlines, of course, in 2013 when police arrested him and two colleagues in Cairo on terrorism charges. The case was widely condemned as an attack on press freedom. Europe eventually released Peter, and he went on to become a great and wonderful press freedom campaigner. His book, The Correspondent, explores his case and the wider war on journalism. It's been updated and re-released to coincide with a movie starring Richard Roxburgh. I've seen the movie, it's very good. And Peter, a great friend, a wonderful colleague in striving for press freedom, please welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sarah. It's a fantastic privilege to be speaking here, introducing these two extraordinary women, extraordinary writers. and a full house. This is incredibly impressive. I reckon you can, as Sarah was just saying, chalk this up to a commitment to this town's commitment to one of the most important features of any working democracy, and that's a willingness to listen and discuss. Before I get underway, I want to also acknowledge the courage of the organisers, given all of the dramas that we've had over the ongoing war in Gaza, the crisis that the Bondi attacks created, even the more recent row over the ISIS brides. I don't know who it was who thought that a good person to introduce this evening's event would be a convicted terrorist. I take my hat off to them. I could see the advertiser's going to burst a blood vessel over this. Ladies and gentlemen, if there's been one consistent thread running through my career, whether it's as a journalist, as a foreign correspondent, or even as a prisoner, it's been a belief in the importance of freedom of speech. It underpinned the work I did as a correspondent reporting around the world. It became central to the campaign to get me out of prison in Egypt, and it's also what brings us here tonight. Because freedom of speech isn't just an abstract principle. It's not something that only matters in courtrooms or in constitutions or in classrooms. It lives or dies in places like this. That happens ideally in conversations, though sometimes in disagreements, in our willingness to sit together and hear from people whose views may challenge us, unsettle us, and possibly even anger us. And that matters especially in moments like the ones we're living through now. The Bondi attack was horrific. It left people shaken, grieving, and afraid, particularly in communities that already felt vulnerable. And I completely understand why the Jewish community feels threatened and why the Islamic community now feels under siege. Those fears are real and they deserve empathy and compassion. But here's the thing, and Sarah was speaking about this a moment ago. Fear does something else. Our instinctive response is to close down our horizons. It pushes us to flatten out the world, to sort voices into safe and dangerous, acceptable and unacceptable, us and them. And once we start doing that, the space for real conversation begins to shrink. Now, there's a concept that I think helps explain why this matters. A few years ago, when I was doing some academic research, I came across an essay published online called The Extinction of the Grey Zone. That term, the grey zone, refers to the space between polarised extremes of black and white. It's that merged space where people of different identities, beliefs and loyalties live together without being forced to choose sides. It's the space where disagreement is possible without division, where argument doesn't become exile, where complexity and nuance are allowed to coexist. The grey zone is the space that artists, musicians, writers, and even journalists need to operate in. And you can't do democratic politics without a broad, healthy grey zone. Now, I don't particularly like the term. A good friend joked that it really ought to be called the rainbow zone for all the colour it brings to our community. But we'll stick with that dull phrase for a moment. So who do you think coined the term? It wasn't some woolly liberal political theorist or woke left-leaning human rights group, nor was it the idea of some idealistic academic. It was Islamic State. They published the essay in the cover of the story as the cover story on their online magazine called Dabiq. And in the essay, Islamic State explicitly declared that one of their goals was to destroy the grey zone. The article outlined how they planned to do that, through violence. Now, the essay made it clear that violence is not the end, but the means. The extremists clearly can't destroy our society through bloodshed alone. They don't have the capacity of a national army. So the way to achieve that aim is through us. The violence is calculated to provoke reactions that polarise us, that make nuance feel dangerous, that push societies like ours into deeply divided camps, to make coexistence feel impossible. Now, the idea isn't entirely new. In the 1870s, European anarchists developed theories around the propaganda of the deed, the idea that through calculated violence you can provoke the reaction you want to achieve. So the uncomfortable truth is this. The grey zone doesn't disappear because extremists attack it. It disappears when we become afraid to sustain it. We don't have to agree with each other to defend the space that allows disagreement to exist. In fact, the health of that space depends on our willingness to hold difficult conversations, not avoid them, to sit with people whose perspectives may feel uncomfortable rather than exclude them from conversations altogether. I'm not suggesting we should condone incitement or explicit hatred. Some forms of speech are beyond the pale. But in my life as a correspondent, in some of the most divided societies on earth, I've seen what happens when humans succumb to that fear. In places like Northern Ireland, or the former Yugoslavia, or Rwanda, where entire communities are deemed as evil, where ethnic cleansing is sold as a strategy for safety, where people are forced into ghettos, sometimes with physical walls dividing them, and at its most extreme, through genocide. I remember in Kenya after the elections in 2007 when the country collapsed into tribal violence. For months it teetered on the brink of civil war, with rival communities attacking each other and running street battles. I remember asking one woman why the fighting was taking place, and she looked at me like I was stupid. "When do we fight?" she asked. And then she answered her own question. "It's only at the time of elections, when politicians sell us fear of the others. That's when this madness happens." Australia is clearly not there yet, but that is where the extremists of all stripes would take us. And that's why tonight matters. Not because everyone on this stage or in this room shares the same views. It's because we share a commitment to the idea that conversation itself is worth protecting. When extremist violence seeks to polarize, to strip away nuance and force us into camps, the most powerful response we can offer is not silence or suppression or censorship, and certainly not withdrawal from difficult conversations and ideas. The most powerful response is what we are doing here tonight. It's engagement. It's about listening. It's about questioning. It's about refusing to let fear narrow the space in which we can think, speak, and live together. Thanks very much.
If you were locked in a prison for hundreds and hundreds of days, fighting for the struggle of truth on charges that were trumped up and false, wouldn't you want Peter Grester in there with you? His intellect and his kindness. Thank you, Peter. And I now get to introduce Louise Adler. Louise was the director, as you know, of the Adelaide Writers' Week from 2023 to 2025. Prior to that role, she spent over 30 wonderful years in the publishing industry, most recently as the publisher at large for Hachette Australia for 17 years, and for 17 years as the CEO of Melbourne University Publishing. She was the president of the Australian Publishers Association, the chair of the Prime Minister's Literary Awards, and the chair of Creative Victoria's Strategy Task Force. Louise is a warrior. She is a dear friend, a mentor to me, and a national treasure. Please welcome Louise.
Thank you. What if I'm my husband? Oh, don't. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll cry, so it's not good to cry. Not now, anyway, later, but thank you so much. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the land of the Kaurna people and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I want to thank my friend, Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, for hosting tonight's event. Sarah has long been a most steadfast advocate for the arts. She's spoken out when it would have been so much easier to remain silent, and I know that for that, she has our collective gratitude. My thanks also, please, yes. My thanks also to Professor Peter Grester for his personal courage and his vital advocacy of independent journalism. I want to also thank Krista Christaki of AFOPA for auspicing tonight's event. Thanks also to the wonderful literary community, including Pink Shorts Press, Jennifer Mills and the Writers' Essay team, Annie Waters of Mostly Books, and everyone else who's been involved in Constellations. I want to also personally thank Sam Shaheen, who's been one of our most generous supporters since 2023, when our troubles began. I also want to pay tribute to my very dear colleagues at Writers' Week, Brett McCallum, Katya Fadick, and Kitty Kuzak, for their friendship, the laughs, their hard work and generosity of spirit in supporting Constellations. I also want to thank you to Michelle Tyson-Clark from the Adelaide Festival, who has helped us all through this very torrid time. In a few moments, Dr. Randa Abdel-Fattah and I will have a conversation about her latest novel, Discipline. But first, I'd ask you to bear with me as I want to reflect on the past couple of months. As we know all too well, the hallmark of the reporting and commentary on the 2026 Writers' Week debacle has been willful misinformation and fact-free reporting. I think it's very important to put it in context why we're here tonight, why we are not at Adelaide Writers' Week. Because if there's one thing that the Israel lobby and their stenographers in the press hate, it's context. This is not the place to relitigate the process that brought Writers' Week 2026 to a grinding halt, but that debacle is symptomatic of the current climate. The Newcastle Literary Festival, the Sydney Writers' Festival, and the Sydney Biennale have all recently been subjected to similar campaigns. So given that, it's worth reflecting on how we got here, to tonight's event and the Not the Writers' Week Festival. In curating the past 4 literary festivals, I've been accused of a multitude of sins. I'm sure you've heard the confected outrage, the acres of column inches ironically devoted to the lament of self-published and self-aggrandising writers. Why am I being silenced? Where are the Jewish invitees, they demand? But curating a festival entails choosing who will and who won't be invited. It's not hypocrisy to choose some writers and not others. Not programming someone who believes they should be invited is not an act of censorship. However, it is not surprising that 1 or 2 embittered memoirists and essayists, aggrieved to have not received an invitation, prefer the aggrandised explanation that they were silenced. Of course, this characterisation is preferable to the simpler explanation that their work might not have been regarded of sufficient literary merit. These grievances are routinely dressed up as a question of balance, that perennial objection made by the Israel lobby when a Palestinian is given the opportunity to speak. Why did I, as the Writers' Week director, privilege Palestinian voices the Murdoch opinionistas continue to carp? I find programming that entails a mandatory tally of writers' ethnic, racial or religious background problematic. But given the accusations by Israel lobbyists and cultural warriors that I failed to program Jewish authors, let's consider the facts according to their own racialised metrics. In 2023, 7 Palestinian writers and 7 Jewish writers participated. In 2024, 1 Palestinian writer and 10 Jewish writers appeared. In 2025, Palestinian writers and 15 Jewish writers appeared. And this year we had planned to include 3 Palestinian and 12 Jewish writers. So given the importance that Israel and its loyal diaspora advocates place on demographic calculations, it's instructive to think about the relationship between the significance accorded to the speech of a single Palestinian writer and academic and the worthlessness accorded to the lives of Palestinians. Or to quote the Israeli Defence Minister, the human animals that live in Gaza and the West Bank. And that is the point. The silencing of Dr. Randa Abdel-Fattah and other Palestinians is the precondition for the perpetuation of their collective dehumanisation. It is hard amidst all the static. It is hard amidst all the static to remember that this is all part of the same Zionist project. 20 Jewish hostages are exchanged for 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. The murder of 1,200 Israelis justifies the murder of more than 70,000 Palestinians. And so the prospect this year of the presence of 3 Palestinian invitees eclipsed the presence of 12 Jewish writers. When it comes to speaking at a literary festival, Palestinians suddenly count as dangerous and as a threat to social cohesion. The exclusion of Dr. Randa Abdel-Fattah was certainly racist, but she was also excluded because she is a reminder of the unbearable truth of the destruction of Gaza and Gazan lives, which must be repressed at all costs. Another aspect of the Writers' Week drama that bears consideration is the way in which false equivalences are deployed, which is why I want to address the gotcha accusations of hypocrisy regarding objections to the appearance of the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. Without wading into the echo chamber that is the opinion pages of The Australian, the Friedman-Abdel-Fattah comparison is instructive. The equivalence being made is symptomatic of the bad faith modus operandi of the Israeli lobby. On the one hand, we have a New York Times columnist, a figure at the heart of the journalistic establishment, and on the other, a Palestinian academic and author who, despite being at the centre of the saga and despite being a respected scholar and award-winning writer, is unable to get an opinion piece published in a mainstream media outlet. To suggest that a scheduling change, or indeed to suggest any objection to Friedman's appearance, amounts to a denial of his free speech is risible. Unlike Dr. Randa Abdel-Fattah, he was not vilified, he was not defamed, and he was not treated with disrespect. The Friedman fixation matters because it's part of a propaganda campaign, one which depends on precisely this kind of false equivalence, as if what we are talking about here is simply a matter of 2 equal sides. The current mantra is Bondi changed everything. The tragedy of 15 innocent individuals being killed was indeed shocking, and we should all, and we must indeed, reflect on that atrocity. But anti-Semitism, like all forms of racism, has always been a scourge, and Australia has a long and ugly history of xenophobia, and Bondi did not change that fact. In this context, the Premier of South Australia deemed Randa Abdel-Fattah's inclusion at Writers' Week culturally insensitive. When the Premier emoted about compassion, I could only marvel at his tin ear, his remarkable insensitivity to Randa, and the 750,000 members of the Australian Muslim community trying to make sense of the genocide in Gaza. It reminded me of the response to the inclusion of a few Palestinian writers back in 2023. Gillian Siegel, the then President of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, with the same tin ear and equally offensively, offered me and my colleagues Holocaust sensitivity training workshops. One can only deduce that selective sensitivity is now deemed to be right and proper. These are some of the questions I hope to explore with Randa Abdel-Fattah this evening, a writer who, according to that renowned literary critic, aka the Premier of New South Wales, is of little literary merit. So let me just remind you of Randa's merit. Her latest novel has just won the People's Choice Prize at the Victorian Premier's Literary Awards. In 2023, 11 Words for Love was shortlisted for the Prime Minister's Literary Awards and was a notable book in the Children's Book Council Awards. In 2017, When Michael Met Minna was the Victorian Premier's Best Young Adult Novel and the People's Choice Award. And Coming of Age in the War on Terror was longlisted for the Stella Prize in 2022 and was shortlisted for the Victorian and New South Wales Premier's Award. I could go on, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Randa Abdel-Fattah to the stage. result. Okay, so you can't hear me. I'm sorry, I forgot the microphone. My apologies. My apologies. So, Randa, thank you so much for being here. I hope you don't mind if I don't use Dr. Abdel-Fattah. No, because I think we've noticed in the media a level of disrespect which has been quite extraordinary. That woman, the radioactive Randa Abdel-Fattah, and so on and so forth. So I want to have tonight the kind of conversation that I feel like I've been privileged to have and to listen to for the last 3 years. About writing, about the craft of writing, about why books matter, and the project of writing discipline. So maybe we can begin by me asking you, why the title? Why discipline?
Can I start? As a Palestinian, it's very important for me to acknowledge the Karuna people and the lands on which we're gathered today and pay my respects to elders past and present, to affirm this was and always will be Aboriginal land, and to extend my deepest love to First Nations peoples here today. Is the sound okay?
It sounds good.
The title, Discipline, was a bit of a wordplay. So part of the book is set in the institutional space of academia, so there was a bit of wordplay about disciplines in academia, about authority and legitimacy, but also the way in which processes and policies and laws are used to discipline us when we speak out.
She's so succinct. I thought because, a long time ago, before you were born, I did a master's on Michel Foucault. I thought it was a reference to discipline and punish. Am I wrong?
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, you're not
I'm
wrong. No, you're not wrong, actually. We're really going to go academic?
We're really getting into it.
So absolutely, part of the book explores, part of the book is actually a creative inspiration from my postdoctoral research, where I looked at the 9/11 generation, so people who were born around 9/11, and I went and conducted writing workshops and interviews with young people, Muslim and non-Muslim, across Sydney schools. And I asked them, what does it feel like to grow up only ever knowing a world at war on terror, that generation? And a lot of what I was noticing, particularly among Muslim students, young Muslim students, was internalizing state power, and that goes back to Foucault's concept of governmentality. You cannot constantly control people through top-down power. Eventually what you need to do is have them internalize power so that they start to regulate and monitor and tame and police their own actions, their own language. And this is what a lot of young Muslims were telling me, that they mute and suppress and self-censor their politics in school for fear of being mischaracterized and misrepresented. And so part of the book explores the way one character does that in the institutional space of the academia and in the media, the way that sometimes the only way that you can survive the racism, the discipline of your voice and your politics is to self-censor, manage your language, and in the end what you're doing is you are participating in your own oppression.
So I have 3,000 questions, so if you're going to applaud at the end of every response, we're going to be here till midnight. I don't mind. I love talking to Randa, but some of you may be tired and want to go home at a certain point. So I'm not trying to control the audience, of course. I hope you don't. As a bit of discipline and punish, here we go. You said you wrote discipline for your community and no longer interested in the white gaze. Did you not think about this novel being perhaps also a teachable moment for white readers?
It was more a revenge plot because once I started writing it, my life could not keep up. Well, the art couldn't keep up with my life. And one of the things that happens in these disciplinary spaces, in these places, in these institutions, which we know, use policy to try and, censor us and silence us and manage how we speak, those processes, what happens is that you start to internalize that. And so for me, that was what was happening, yeah.
And the importance of writing for your community to kind of turn away from, is it that you felt no longer an obligation to, because I read this book, I think white readers, non-Palestinians would read this book and have a deep understanding, an increased understanding or awareness of the complexities of living life as a Palestinian in Australia today.
Yeah.
And
I forgot to answer that. I'm fasting, so the
Yes.
fasting brain. Okay, yeah, absolutely. So if you look at my the repertoire of books that I've written, I started writing when I was 16, actually. The first book was me writing in a post-Gulf War teenage coming of age. And then I rewrote the book straight after 9/11. And that was very much about correcting the record, explaining, defending, justifying, just the idea that if you only knew who Muslims were, you wouldn't assume that we were terrorists. I have come a long way since then, where the white gaze, the white opinion, the white respectability politics means absolutely nothing to me. What I wanted to do with this book was to write a book that validated the experiences, the trauma, the struggles of young, racialized journalists and academics who are working and living with the weight of a genocide on their shoulders, and to give them a sense that they can be seen in these pages, and to really go through, especially Hannah's story, to show the struggle that it takes to have to show up at work and do the water cooler talk and pretend that your family isn't trying to exist under bombs in Gaza, or that you aren't a young mother trying to raise a newborn child, having to show up at work and still do the what did you do on the weekend, and pretend that you didn't check your WhatsApp to see if your family members were still alive. And so for me, this gets completely erased, and the way that we live as racialized communities, and First Nations people have known this before we do. They have deaths in custody as the green screen of their lives. They have, stolen generations as the green screen of their lives. It's constant in their lives, and yet you have to still show up and pretend that life goes on. And for me, it was so important to validate that. And if white readers read that and had a window into that trauma and extended solidarity, that was a bonus. And if my enemies read it and used that as an opportunity for me to show them how much contempt I have for them, especially white liberals, that was an added bonus.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the narrative, the story you've written. It starts with Nabil, a high school student who's accused of terrorism, and you set out you have a cast of characters, 3 principal characters in the novel, but you started with 5 characters. Why did you end up reducing it to these 3 main characters?
So I started writing the book in 2022, and I still have the emails where I was approaching and pitching the book to publishers and saying, is there any interest in, an appetite for anybody to read about the world of countering violent extremism and the world of surveillance in, Muslim communities and highly racialized communities, and the way that that trickles down onto young people? It just feels that this is out of the headlines. And there was a little bit of interest, and, I wanted to talk about what it means to try and express your political agency as a young person when you are living in a world and in communities that are hyper-securitized, hyper-surveilled, where your bodies, your geographies, your language are infused with negative stereotypes, which, even when I interviewed some young people, they said to me that when they hear the word Allahu Akbar, they immediately think of terrorism. Now, they weren't born that way. That is the cumulative weight of years of headlines and popular culture and policy. And so it's, trying to get a story about that is something I wanted to do. And then October 23 happened. I was creatively paralyzed. I put it aside. And then I returned to it, as I said, when my art couldn't keep up with my life. And I thought, actually, I can't write a book that's set as my people are enduring a live stream genocide. What I'm angriest about as a Palestinian is all of this was preventable. What I am angriest about is that those tens of thousands of children, those hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who have been slaughtered on our phones, the blame for that, the accountability is on the media which manufactured consent for this genocide. It's on the journalists, like the one who refused to let me say apartheid on Q&A in 2021. It's on the journalists who dared to mute our political language, who dared to censor us, who dared to say that what we saw was not testimony, or we weren't reliable witnesses. And so for me, this book, I restructured it to say, let's talk about accountability. If you had said something as an academic, as a journalist, when you had the chance in 2021, Israel's last bombardment, would we be here now, where we have reports declaring what Palestinians on the ground have been declaring, if you had believed brown bodies as reliable witnesses? But we need a UN body or a report to verify the witness testimony of the actual victims. And this is why I said it in May 2021, to have that distance and to hold my readers to account, to say, when you have the courage of your convictions to actually speak the truth of what you see, then that is an act that can stop the violence of silence and the violence of obfuscation.
And I want to ask you, just pause a moment, just to be away from the actual narrative, about the process of finding a publisher. You end up with the wonderful Aviva Tuffield at University of Queensland Press. Yes, big clap for Aviva. But the process of finding, what were the months, what years were you actually what year were you pitching the book? And what was the response of publishers to the proposal? I wonder if they ran to the hill for the hills.
Well, it's very funny. I was in the US at a Palestine Rights Literature Festival in September 2023, and I was sitting in the hotel in New York when I emailed the pitch to a publisher here, and the response was, the first page is too political. And I thought, oh, fuck. This is not the publisher for me. And so after that, I realized I would only seek out a publisher who wanted a work that was political, and that was in the amazing, indefatigable Aviva Tuffield.
Yes. So it's interesting that you raised the question of the political novel, because this is incontrovertibly a political novel. And after the Spanish Civil War, a couple of editors put together an anthology called Authors Take Sides. That collection, that anthology, was then reproduced or reissued after a succession of other wars, including the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the Gulf War. And while I was at MUP, we published an Australian edition of that book. And I went around to Australian authors asking them if they would like to take part. And I remember ringing up Frank Morehouse, now no longer with us, Frank Morehouse. And he said, oh, that's an interesting idea, but why aren't you doing a collection called Dentists Take Sides? And I said, well, if he'd met my dentist, he'd probably know why. But the question was an interesting question, and he was sort of balking at the idea that authors are required to take sides, or that I was asking authors if they were interested in taking sides about this particular war. In the end, of course, he gave us a contribution. It was a wonderful contribution. I wondered how you thought about the idea of writing the political novel, and the difference between creating an imaginative world and the relationship with actual current events, which we have in this novel, and a kind of position that you want to articulate, how you thought about that in crafting the novel.
You can't ask a Palestinian to separate their politics from their existence. There's a beautiful poem from a Palestinian poet in Gaza who is actually addressing this question of art and politics, and he says, in order for me to write poetry that is not political, I must listen to the birds sing. And in order for me to hear the birds sing, the warplanes must be silent. And I think that is a metaphor for what it means to move in the world as a Palestinian, as a First Nations person. You cannot sit down at your computer and say, I'm going to suspend my politics and the live stream genocide of my people as I choose which adjective to place in this sentence. The craft comes from the desire to see a better world. The craft comes from the burning pain and rage within us. And that is the beauty and the struggle of writing these stories. For me, it's not a question of having to separate the politics from the art. All art is political. And it drives me crazy when the white Western liberal subject assumes that they are objective and neutral. There's an excellent quote by a Colombian professor, Santiago Castro Gomez, who says the Western myth the Western myth of point zero means the Western myth of a point of view that sees itself as beyond a point of view. It is a false statement to think that anything is neutral or objective. It is 100% rooted in some kind of ideology. And the most obvious when I hear journalists say, be balanced, be neutral in genocide, is how can you be neutral over genocide? To say that you are neutral or objective over the slaughter of other human beings is in and of itself a position, is in and of itself taking a side. It's just that, and there are many journalists, there are many artists who are happy to wear their politics on their sleeves. And I'm unapologetic about the fact that the elephant in the room here is the Palestinian is not considered a human being. The essence of all of this is the racism and the dehumanization, because you can be political about anything. And those who are loudest in silencing about our politics are very happy to be political on many other subjects, but the red line for them is the Palestinian as the human.
So let's talk about some of the characters in the novel. You mentioned Hannah. She's the only Muslim journalist in her workplace. She shows us how people of colour survive or don't in the modern mainstream media newsroom. She's subjected to open and tacit racism. She's exploited for her community connections, and yet her individual experience is ignored. We have, actual evidence of this, don't we?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, when my young Arab journalist friends call me and say, I'm about to read Discipline, I say to them, it's going to be triggering for you because you're going to see those stories, that gaslighting, the management of your voices, the transactional way that you are used and exploited to get closer to communities, and then your stories are managed in a way that always is about the white gaze or about certain racist tropes. So for me, Hannah is Palestinian. She's married to a Palestinian man from Gaza, and she's a new young mum. She's a young journalist, and I really wanted to show that the struggle of trying to bring every version of yourself to work and having to mute and suppress aspects of yourself. Because the thing is, we know that all these institutions, they just love extracting diversity from us. They love our food, they love our culture, they love our music. They absolutely love the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion, so long as you behave. So long as you leave your politics at the door, your grief, your anger, your rage, so long as you're not a difficult woman at work or a difficult man at work. And she problematizes that space because she is in a time of grief. Her in-laws are in Gaza. Every morning they wake up, are they alive? And there is a gross insensitivity to what it means to move through these workplaces as a Palestinian in the last 2 years. And I will say that even amongst allies in the workplaces, people do not realize what it means for us every single day to wake up. I likened it, it came to me when I was watching Avatar with my kids on the holidays, and we went to one where you wore the 3D glasses, and it occurred to me, because my brain never switches off about these things as I was sitting there pretending to enjoy the movie with my kids, is that these 3D glasses, when it got too much, I put it down. But as Palestinians, we are literally, I am not exaggerating, moving every single second of our day as if we're wearing 3D glasses, and we are seeing the genocide as we are talking to you, pretending that the world is in a 2D space. But every moment, we are experiencing in a visceral way. What's the first thing you do when you wake up, Louise? The first thing I do, the first thing I know every Palestinian I know does, is reach for their phone and check if their friends or family are alive. And that is what Hannah brings to her workplace. So if I can give people a glimpse into that is what politics is, the embodied experience of living through your people's genocide.
One of the other sites of the novel is the university, and I can't help but have enjoyed that section very well, comprehensively. And your rendition, I think, is pitch perfect. These institutions that invoke freedom of speech rhetoric while simultaneously prohibiting some speech and allowing other speeches. I suppose when I think of universities, I'm reminded of the definition of the Oxford Senate, a hotbed of cold feet. But I wondered how your own experience at Macquarie University informed the characters of Ashraf and Jamal.
Do you want to get me fired again?
Do I want to get you
me
fired?
fired?
No,
I've already
not
been
at all.
suspended. No,
They can't fire you now.
No.
It's all over. You've won. You have won.
Before we talk about the university space, can I talk about Adelaide quickly? Because I think this is very much a metaphor for what we're talking about here, about the whole use of diversity. I remember when I went to read the statement about my cancellation, I had to first go through an acknowledgement of country on the website. And I think that juxtaposition of performativity and then racism captures every single institution in this white supremacist country. And this is what it's like in university spaces. You know, the statements of solidarity that you send to colleagues who have CVs with pages and pages of articles written about settler colonialism and racism, and they don't even respond to your statement of solidarity, or they outright refuse to sign it. Those who have built careers off the backs of community, studying them, researching them, exploiting them, extracting from them, writing about them, but never ever live those values. It's just performance, it's just words, it's just filling up the CV. And the thing is, I could have written about that in a way that was solemn and somber, but instead I had fun. Because you can only ridicule these people because they are caricatures of themselves. And one thing that proves that is that so many of my academic friends said, "Were you talking about my boss? Were you?" And I'm like, no, this is the one time when I didn't need to write a 3D dimensional character because they are really just such stereotypes of themselves. The material was just there in every institution. You always have the one who pretends to be on your side and the ally, but will never ever speak up against management, who will always maintain and protect the status quo, or those who, within diversity, equity, inclusion committees, and for the most part, they're all white people on those committees. So the ironies and the contradictions, they deserve to be ridiculed because they are embarrassing.
And my friends in universities don't like it, but I always remember, liberal sitcom and The West Wing, and President Jed Bartlett saying that politics is a dog-eat-dog world. In the academy, it's the other way round. Takes a while for people. So Ashraf, he's a secular liberal scholar. He's trying to survive in the academy. You call him the model minority, but interestingly, you don't demonise him. Is he an opportunist, or is that too harsh?
Yeah, so Ashraf is a character in the book. He's Egyptian background. He's very much internalized a lot of Islamophobia. He represents a certain generation. I've got a lot of uncles like this who, it's an existential crisis for them. The idea that if you're approximate to whiteness, if you perform as the model minority, if you work hard, you can rise, the corporate ladder or the university ladder, and then you can bring people up with you. It's very much a mindset of gratitude. Don't rock the boat, because there's a sense that if you do, you'll be threatened. There's never any courage there to change the system, to challenge the system, because there is a sense of understanding your position within it. And I think it also represents very much an existential dilemma for many racialized minorities who are so enamored by the white liberal promises and believe in it. The idea that settler colonial recognition is going to make me successful, because think about it, when they actually confront the fact that this is a white supremacist system and that you are only as good as your silence, that represents a really major dilemma for people who have come as refugees or come for a better life here, to realize actually at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, if I dissent, if I speak up, I will be crushed. And we have seen that play out since the genocide in Gaza, that we have seen the way that minority communities who have spoken up have been crushed. We've seen students, for goodness sakes, at encampments, brutalized, imprisoned, their university degrees threatened because they've chosen to stand up and because they've refused the lies that the state has told them. And so for Ashraf, for me, I didn't want to demonize him, because I do believe that there are people who have grown up thinking, particularly post 9/11, that if we only behave, then they'll let us be, they'll let us succeed. And my research and my lived experiences tells me that like misogyny, white supremacy will brook no dissent. And so if you are the difficult woman, misogyny will come down hard. If you are going to challenge the white supremacist system, you will be crushed.
So I was thinking about 9/11, and you said that you were radicalised post 9/11, and I was trying to figure out your age, and I was going to ask you, well, why were you not radicalised before? And I thought, well, maybe Randa was about 11, and maybe that's an unfair question. But I think we agreed you were a little older than 11. So why weren't you radicalised before, in thinking about your own history and your own personal formation?
So I don't know where. After 9/11, it wasn't after 9/11 that I was radicalised in terms of my racial literacy. That came after my PhD. After 9/11, my politics was actually quite shameful. Reflecting on it now, I understand now what it represented at that time. We were in the early 2000s, I was a university student. I had just finished university when the 9/11 occurred. And we were in a time of complete fear that, there was a collective sense of defense, of guilt by association. And we genuinely believed that the reason that we were being attacked and vilified, my mum was the principal at an Islamic school. We had pig's head thrown in the office window, arson attacks, a litany of case after case after case of abuse and racism. And the idea then of still a very young Muslim community was, we need to just explain that Islam does not condone terrorism. And if only people understood our faith, then they would understand that, that these associations and misrepresentations are false. It was very naive not to understand the political economy in which terrorism operates, the military-industrial complex, and that these states have no interest in who we are as individuals. So I lacked the kind of racial understanding then. It was only after I did my PhD looking at Islamophobia in Australia from the point of view of the perpetrators. So I started to interview people in 2015, 2014 who were openly Islamophobic, who had just started some of the more far-right parties, and trying to understand the Islamophobia. And that's the point at which I realized I have been misunderstanding who I am on this colony all these years. I am a settler. I cannot understand Islamophobia here unless I understand that this state was built on stolen land, and that my understanding of race here must be tied to understanding, as Aileen Morton Robinson says, First Nations distinguished professor, that we have the unfinished business of Indigenous sovereignty, and everything else stems from that. And that's when I was radicalised. That's when I understood I don't care about multicultural liberal promises. I care about my position here as a settler of colour and my solidarity with First Nations people, and that's where liberation, collective liberation lies.
Thank you. So acres of column inches have been devoted to a couple of your social media comments, and I wanted to ask you about a couple of them specifically. The idea of cultural safety, I've listened to you explain it, and I wondered whether you would explain it for this audience. What you mean by cultural safety, I think that it's been taken by Zionists to imply that their physical safety is imperiled in spaces that Palestinians might speak, or that's what's at risk. And so I wondered if you could tease out for us what the notion of cultural safety actually means.
Yeah, well, in your opening remarks, Louise, you spoke about the importance of context and how mainstream media is almost programmed to decontextualize everything that we say and do. And so the context of my intervention on social media, in which I said that Zionists do not have the right to cultural safety, is really key to understand. It was in the context of the State Library of Victoria cancelling a series of online writing workshops with writers and poets of colour, and they cited as the reason the cultural safety of the children who were going to participate. So basically implying that the workshops to be run by these Arab and writers of colour and diverse writers would put these children at risk, that they were culturally unsafe for them. And then at Wamalade Festival, there was an electronic dance company, I think 47, it's not my genre of music, but a Palestinian electronic dance group who were also cancelled. And this reason was cited again, cultural safety. On top of that, we were seeing at the time, this is March 2024, and it's very important for me to foreground this, and because it continues until today, the privileging of one group's sensitivities and feelings and emotions over the facts of a genocide. We are living in a world in which what we are being told is to deny the evidence of what we can see and defer to the feelings of those who support and sympathize with our genocide. Hanan Ashrawi, after the Oslo Accords, said that they have made the occupied responsible for the security of their occupiers. And I liken it to they have made the victims of a genocide responsible for the feelings of those who support their genocide. And I refuse that. I refuse it because there's a difference between facts and feelings. And there was a Palestinian in a refugee camp in Haifa in 1948 who said a line that has stuck with me in her memoir. She was repeatedly told by Western powers that she had voluntarily migrated to Lebanon in a refugee camp in 1948, and she was part of the Nakba. And she said, Zionist deeds are more eloquent than Zionist words. Likewise, African-American novelist James Baldwin said, I don't believe what you say because I can see what you do. And this is the crux of the matter. We are constantly asked to defer to the feelings of people while we see the dismembered bodies of Palestinian babies on our screens. And that is the essence of the racism that we are confronting. And that is why I intervened to say that if you are a Zionist, a political ideology, there's no such thing as Zionist DNA, Zionist food, as, you're not born a Zionist. It is a political ideology. And like all political ideologies, communism, settler colonialism, liberalism, it should be subject to the same normative interrogation as any ideology. And as a person who works in the academic space, the art space, if a student were to stand up in class and start to speak in defense of white supremacy, in defense of segregation, racial segregation, or if a misogynist stood up and said, men are superior to women, if a settler colonialist sympathizer were to stand up and say, I have the right to steal this group's land and to build my state on top of it, we would shut that down. We would shut that down. And yet we are being asked to exceptionalize the ideology of Zionism. And so no, racialized communities, racialized peoples have the right to cultural safety. It's actually a concept that comes from Maori nursing educators that actually comes out of the experiences of violence and colonization, which says that racialized communities and people have the right to cultural safety, not ideologies. And that's the distinction. Jews have the right to cultural safety. Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims. Ideologies don't. They should be subject to interrogation and critiqued. And that is the fundamental difference, that the people who are attacking me want to protect an ideology that argues for the dispossession of my people's land, that argues for settler colonialism, that argues for genocide, to be exempt from criticism. Where is my cultural safety as a Palestinian? If you rob me of my right to use my political language to analyze what is happening to my people, where is my cultural safety? How am I supposed to talk about my liberation and my people's freedom if you are taking the very words from my mouth? What is left for me then? And that is, again, the heart of the question here, that who we are as Palestinians is so deeply dehumanized that did not ever come up. That those who claim the right to cultural safety have never given me my right to cultural safety as a Palestinian.
So that explanation, that teasing out of what you had in mind when you used the term, it's a nuanced, sophisticated, comprehensive arguing of a position. The tweets that you've crafted have been taken, as they are undifferentiated, they're not your tweets, but the reception of them, or some would say that the tweets are not nuanced or not subtle enough or not sophisticated or not contextualised enough. So how do you balance, you're thinking about your use of social media, how do you think about that, given the explanation you've just given us, which, seems to me to be completely cogent, and I happen to agree with it, but that's not the point. But why bother with social media, for example, if the response you get on social media is to trivialise, demonise, vilify, contort, distort what you've had to say or what you're thinking about?
It's an excellent question, because I've really been reflecting on this, given the controversy and mischaracterization of my tweets, and actually the way that the lobby almost conducts an audit of what I've said online and picks and chooses and cherry picks for a political campaign and agenda. And when I go back to the tweets that have raised, the ones that have been recycled the most in Senate hearings and Murdoch press, and even by politicians on all sides, one thing that I realize is that as a Palestinian, you don't have the right to an emotion, to rage, to anger. You don't have that right. Every time you say something in public, you must add an academic reference. You must add something to legitimize and provide an alibi to your political agency, because your victim impact statement is never enough. So if I had provided some citations to a tweet, maybe I would have been protected. But I think about it now, because it's like what I said to you before about the 3D glasses. People just don't understand the level of ongoing trauma every single day is. Some of those tweets, conveniently, people ignore the fact that I quote tweeted, which means I shared material underneath it. That was the context. One of them was the attack on a hospital in which a journalist was standing outside with 4 other journalists waiting for his wife, who was giving birth, and he was killed in a bomb. The other one was the babies on New Year's Day, I think, or New Year's Eve, 2025, who were frozen to death because of the blockade. And so very often, we are watching horror upon horror upon horror, and there were times, like you said, the only available space we have is social media. I would have loved to write an opinion piece about cultural safety, but every single opinion piece I've ever sent to The Age or the Sydney Morning Herald or to The Guardian gets knocked back. And so instead of a nice long essay, I get 140 characters, and that is what we are left with. And I understand now the space we are in is so malicious and vexatious and dangerous, given the way that lawfare is now being used against us, that we don't even have the luxury to express our rage or anger, despite the horror that we are witnessing.
So while we're witnessing, I'm just thinking about the catalogue of instances in the last couple of years where universities, arts organisations, media organisations have been under attack. While we're witnessing a live stream genocide in Gaza. And I think you've said that you think that these have been the greatest source of repression and gaslighting. Do you think, taking a broader view of it, that this is the latest iteration for the lobby, the Murdoch press, however we want to describe the forces arraigned against the kind of discussion you're hoping to have, that this is the latest iteration of the culture wars. When I look at, the Gillian Segal report card that Greg Craven's to have on universities, for example, or, what happened at Bendigo or to Khalid Sabsabi, or however many other instances, or, here in Adelaide and the Premier's actions. Do you think it's a refreshed, revised form of the culture wars? Or maybe it's never ended, maybe we're just perpetual, we've had a long time of this. But do you think that's what's going on?
I think it borrows from the culture wars. It uses the culture wars to legitimize the work that it's doing. But I think that the objective and the agenda is to shield Israel from critique. And I think that it can package it in some coverage as culture wars, particularly around the arts. And we have seen that, all the woke leftists criticizing conservative voices, and because that will appeal to a certain demographic. I mean, I see racists very much as lazy, and they will use a smorgasbord and they'll take whatever they can, consume from it that's going to work. And so in some articles, it's very much couched as the culture wars, and a lot of the coverage around us was about that. On the other hand, I think it's important to understand this moment since October and the repression and the collusion between the state and institutions, and the way that they are ingratiating themselves and appeasing, Hasbara propaganda and these tactics to silence us is it's political work, and it's very much about silencing and crushing our voices about a genocide. And I think that's the reason why we're seeing it, the reason why we're seeing this escalate and get even worse is because they've lost. This is the beast thrashing around. They've lost an entire generation. You can't tell them, no, kids aren't starving, when they're looking at their iPhones at lunchtime in the schoolyard and seeing the emaciated babies' bodies. Or, we are defending ourselves, and they're setting dogs on a Down syndrome boy or shooting children in the head. The catalogue of horror is ongoing, and it beggars belief even to articulate it. But there's a whole generation who can see that. And so because they've lost that, well, we know because of the billions that are being poured into social media to silence and to control and to shadow ban, the only thing left for them is not dialogue, it's not expressing ourselves, it's not giving us any platforms, it's to crush and silence us. That coercive, force of the state has come down on us. And I think that the culture wars serve that purpose.
Yeah. And it's interesting, though, at the level of language that, the lexicon seems to me to have shifted. I'm not being a Pollyanna here, but 2 years ago, terms like genocide or apartheid would have been so transgressive. They would have been taboos. That's a real shift, isn't it? And we're talking about the West. We're talking about the Western world, even the Western media have crept very ever so timidly towards using that kind of language.
Yeah, because hundreds of thousands of people have been slaughtered, and even still it takes a lot of effort for some people to still use those words. But I do feel as well that it's because now it's undeniable, and the weight of evidence. I mean, everything that Palestinians have been telling you for decades has been ignored. It was only when, UN reports and outsiders and Westerners validated the evidence of the native that people started to maybe use that language. So there's a lot of anger and bitterness from us as Palestinians about that as well, because, our actual lived experience has never been enough. How many interviews we did before October 2023 where we would fight with journalists about using the language of what we could see, occupation, illegal occupation, settler colonialism, apartheid, racism, and all of it was always a struggle. We would send an article back in the day where I had some hope of an article, and it would just be, can you change this word? Can you change that word? It was a constant back and forth. You were never considered reliable. You always needed an alibi. I think, there's been a shift now because it is undeniable.
It's incontrovertible. It's
Yeah,
on our,
and
it's on
at
our
what
phones.
cost? You know, as Palestinians, we say the price that we have paid for the world to see what we have been saying for over 78 years.
So, last question. Your novel raises many issues, including gender. Hannah, who's juggling work and being a new mother. And I've been thinking of you during these few months, these last, well, many months really, of how you've survived the constant vilification. I remember calling you while you were writing your latest piece for Mondo Weiss. You were with your children during school holidays, probably watching that boring movie, and the media were relentlessly pursuing. The last question is, I wanted to know how you coped.
I cope because...
Coped.
Coped.
Past tense.
How did I cope?
Sorry, I'm being pedantic.
No, that's... I guess because every time that I felt like it was too much, you don't have time as a Palestinian to self-indulge and to, lick your wounds and get into that woe is me, because you're very, very conscious of the fact that everything is compared to Gaza. And so there's that. You don't really give yourself permission to wallow in self-pity. Number two is that when you're with your kids, you're not Randa the activist or the academic, you're just mum. And there is a kind of, comfort in walking in the doors and them treating you exactly as they see you. And you are forced to show up as a mum and to forget the outside world. But then, as you said, it encroaches. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to live as a racialized mother and to parent as a racialized person is difficult because you want to switch off. There's a luxury in switching off. But at the same time, I look at my children and I say to myself, they look like the kids on my phone, and the world that I am fighting for is for them. I've lived my life. The world that they deserve and all children deserve is the world that we have to fight for. And those are the sort of things I tell myself to cope. But it's not easy. I'm not going to pretend that it's easy, because at the end of the day, racism, it robs you of time. As Toni Morrison said, racism a distraction. It robs you of time. It robs you of sometimes your dreams and ambitions. But the one thing that it will never take away is community. It will never take away self-worth. And it will never take away purpose in life. And I think if you live without purpose, that's when you know that they've won. And it has never been more crystal clear to me that Gaza has clarified for so many people why we are on this earth and what we need to do to make it a better place. And I think for me that shows that we are victorious and that they won't win.
So, champion. Thank you so much, Randa. Thank you for your courage, thank you for your empathy, and thank you for your humanity.